Hi, I'm Ben with Beretta. Here today to talk to you about how to swap the hammer out on your 90 series pistol. M9, 92, 96, any of the various iterations of the Vertec, they're all going to be exactly the same. So before we do anything to any of our firearms, we always want to make sure that they're unloaded and safe. Remove your magazine, and then make sure to remove your grips. This allows us clear access to the hammer pin and to the mainspring pin. Yes, my grips are magical, and I don't have to take screws out. Remove your slide and slide assembly, and then we're just down to the bare frame. Now before we move forward, one of the things that I'd like to point out is if you ever have any questions or you run into a problem or something that doesn't make any sense, make sure to contact a gunsmith or somebody here at Beretta, maybe one of the gunsmiths, to walk you through it. Or if you hit a major problem, you may want to send the gun in or again take it to a gunsmith. Not something that you want to force. A lot of these small parts, the way that they interface, if you get something wrong and you force them together, you could destroy the gun. The other thing is when we're talking about hammers, especially when the slide is removed, you don't want to press the trigger and drop the hammer on the bare frame. Because you've got a piece of steel smacking up against a piece of aluminum, you can damage the frame or you could damage the hammer. So be careful, if you're going to lower the hammer, to hold the hammer while you pull the trigger and slowly let the hammer forward. So speaking of which, before we move forward on removing the hammer, the first thing we want to do is lower the hammer and slowly allow it to come all the way forward so we take all the pressure off of the mainspring. Now you're going to want to have some type of a block or some type of hard piece of wood because we're going to need to compress the mainspring cap up into the mainspring so we can remove this pin here that holds the mainspring cap in place. To do that, you're also going to want a small punch. We're going to take the mainspring, and the thing that I like to do is get kind of a hammer grip on the frame with the dust cover pointing back at me. And I'm just going to press down on the mainspring cap and press out the mainspring pin. If you get everything lined up properly, it really shouldn't take a lot of pressure to do it. So your mainspring cap is going to fall out, and the mainspring cap pin will also come out the other side. Now your mainspring is basically just floating there. It'll wind up falling out if you pick up your frame. So right now, the only thing holding in the hammer is the hammer pin. And the best way to get the hammer pin out is to pull your trigger, and because it's not under spring pressure, it's not going to fly forward. It'll just go all the way back into the rear position. This makes sure that the trigger bar clears the hammer pin. So go ahead and grab your punch and just press the hammer pin out. It'll pop out the other side. Hammer pin is this big T-looking thing. From there, the hammer just pops right out. So the hammer strut that basically interfaces with the spring stays in the receiver. And that's something you don't want to turn it upside down or flop that out of there. You want to just go ahead and make sure that that stays inside. So if you get a new hammer or whatever the case may be, you're just going to grab it and stick it back into the frame in the same position. And all you want to do is pull the trigger so the trigger bar comes forward and clears that hole so you can put the hammer pin back in. Now make sure that the big side of the hammer pin is on the opposite side of the trigger bar. Otherwise it just won't go in. Just go ahead and slip that in, and everything will line up. So at this point, you can feel if everything's lined up. If you pull the trigger and you put some manual pressure on the hammer, it should pull back and then pop forward. So from here, we want to put our mainspring in, and if you look up inside the mainspring housing, or the hole inside the frame, you'll see the hammer strut. Take one of the sides of the mainspring and just try and guide it over that hammer strut. You want to make sure that it actually goes onto the hammer strut and doesn't go next to it. Because if it's not on the hammer strut, the gun won't operate properly. So once you have that lined up, you're now going to take your mainspring cap, put it on top of the spring, and compress it in. Now be careful when you're doing this, because this thing can become a projectile and go flying across the room. So again, we're going to get our hammer grip on the frame, we're going to put this in, and then we're just going to press it against that block and make sure that you get it lined up. Now here's another little tip. The lanyard loop, if you push this too far in, you're going to wind up actually pushing the pin through the lanyard loop and not through the hole in the mainspring cap. So make sure that you have it lined up in the right area, and make sure that all your holes are aligned so everything goes in where it's supposed to. And if you feel some pressure pushing back, stop, check, and make sure that that spring is on the hammer strut. That's very important. So try again. And again, if the pressure doesn't feel quite right, pull it back off, double check, and make sure that that spring is on the hammer strut. So now I'm going to go nice and slow. I'm going to press the frame back down on, and I'm going to see if I can get that hole lined up. And I want to go nice and slow and make sure that that hole's lined up, and I may even take my punch and put it through and make sure that I'm actually lined up with the hole. And right now I don't feel it lined up, so something's not quite on. So what will happen is when you're pressing that mainspring cap in, it may twist to the side, and you're not going to get a clear shot at that hole. The other thing that you want to make sure of is that the hammer is all the way forward against the frame, because that's going to relieve the most amount of pressure off of that spring. So make sure that hammer is not back on the secondary cock notch, the half cock. You want to make sure it's all the way against the frame. So right now I've got my punch in there, which you could call a slave pin, and I know that everything's lined up and everything's where it needs to be. So now I can back my punch out, I can put my regular pin in, and it just goes in with finger pressure. So once you know you have everything lined up, the pin's very easy to slide in. Hammer cocks, drops, everything seems to be functional, so everything operates. So now I can put my slide back on, lock it into place, drop that. I can press the trigger to make sure that I have full function. It cocks all the way, drops. There's a half cock notch that it hits. Decock operates. Weapon seems to be operational. So now I can put my grips back on and make sure before you were to use this for defensive purposes or anything, go to the range and do a test fire to make sure that your weapon operates. That's about all it takes to swap out your hammer. So if you have any other questions or anything comes up, make sure to contact a competent gunsmith. And remember, this is not one of those situations where if it doesn't fit, use a bigger hammer. For more tips, check us out on Facebook at Beretta USA, Twitter at Beretta_USA, or YouTube at Beretta Community.